They say power doesn't need to raise its voice. And on February 16th, 2026, at exactly 9:40 in the morning, Meghan Markle learned that lesson in the most humiliating way possible. Not with cameras flashing, not with security dragging her away, but with something far more chilling: silence. Picture this: Dubai International Airport, Terminal 3, one of the most exclusive entry points in the world. A place where billionaires, diplomats, and royalty glide through immigration without a second glance. Meghan Markle arrived that morning believing she'd found her safe haven. A city known for discretion, luxury, and above all, control. A place where scandal could be managed, where narratives could be rewritten, where a fresh start was just a passport stamp away. But here's what she didn't anticipate. Her passport was scanned, the screen flickered, and then, nothing. No explanation, no apology. Just a subtle gesture from the immigration officer, directing her away from the public queue and into a private room. The kind of room where conversations happen behind soundproof glass. The kind of room where your phone doesn't work and nobody's coming to help you. What happened in that room? Nobody's saying. But what we do know is this: by 10:15, the decision was final. Entry denied. Not delayed, not conditional, denied. And here's the part that should send chills down anyone's spine. There was no press release, no statement, no explanation to the media. Because Dubai doesn't owe anyone an explanation. When you operate with the kind of power Dubai has, you don't argue, you don't defend, you simply close the door. And once that door closes, it doesn't reopen. Witnesses who saw her leave that private area described her expression as controlled, but the tension was unmistakable. Not shock, not confusion. Anger. The kind of anger that comes from realizing you've been outmaneuvered by people who never even raised their voice. Within hours, she was gone. No apology tour, no second chance. Just gone. Now, you might be wondering, why would one of the most celebrity-friendly cities on earth turn away someone as high-profile as Meghan Markle? After all, Dubai welcomes influencers, entertainers, and controversial figures all the time. So what made her different? Here's where it gets interesting. Dubai operates on a principle that most Western countries have completely forgotten. Predictability matters more than popularity. It's not about being liked, it's about being manageable. And over the past few months, Meghan Markle had become the opposite of manageable. Think about it: global media turbulence, conflicting public narratives, legal battles, staff complaints, financial uncertainty, reputational chaos across multiple jurisdictions. To Dubai's decision-makers, this wasn't about judging her character, it was about risk assessment, and in their calculation, she represented volatility. Not scandal, not guilt, volatility. And in a city built on control, volatility is the one thing they cannot tolerate. But here's what makes this rejection so devastating. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. And procedural decisions are the hardest ones to reverse because they don't respond to apologies, explanations, or public pressure. They respond to systems, and once a system flags you, the conversation is over. Dubai's governance model doesn't make impulsive decisions. Every high-profile immigration matter goes through layers of assessment. By the time a passport reaches that scanner, the evaluation has already occurred. The decision has already been made. What Dubai did wasn't unique. It was just visible. Behind closed doors, in private meetings, in risk assessments conducted by governments, brands, and institutions around the world, similar conclusions had already been reached. Dubai just happened to act on it first. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If one of the most tightly controlled cities in the world quietly made this decision, how many others have been thinking the same thing but haven't acted yet? Now let's rewind. Because to understand why this moment happened, we need to go back, way back, to a time that Meghan Markle probably thought was buried forever: Toronto, Canada, 2012 to 2015. For over a decade, this chapter of her life was presented as a clean, professional story. She was an actress on the rise, building her career on the set of Suits, living independently, preparing for the global stage. Simple, straightforward, settled. But in early February 2026, that story started cracking. It began quietly. An off-camera audio leak here, a social media post there. Then, former acquaintances started surfacing. People who hadn't spoken publicly in years suddenly had things to say, and what they were saying didn't match the official narrative. At the center of it all was a name: Chef Corey Vitiello. Now, Meghan's relationship with Vitiello was never a secret. They were together during her Toronto years. That part was always acknowledged. But the timeline? The depth of the relationship? The way it ended? Those details were starting to look very different under renewed scrutiny. Reports emerged describing shared residency, intertwined social circles, and a sudden breakup in mid-2015. But here's where it gets murky. Earlier biographies had suggested Meghan lived a more independent lifestyle during that period. The inconsistencies were small at first, but they added up. Then came the podcast. A Toronto-based investigative show released an episode featuring an anonymous interview with someone described as a former long-term partner. Technically, the identity wasn't confirmed, but listeners didn't need a name. The references to specific locations, dates, and private moments made it obvious who was speaking, and what this person implied was explosive. Not accusations of crimes, but questions. Questions about whether certain aspects of Meghan's personal history had been selectively edited when she entered royal life. But wait, it gets worse. Rumors began circulating about a sealed marriage record in the United States, allegedly dating back to 2011. Now, let's be clear, no court has publicly confirmed this document exists. Meghan's legal team has called these claims speculative and defamatory. But here's the problem. The rumor won't die. It keeps resurfacing across multiple platforms, gaining traction, and forcing institutions to take it seriously. Why? Because if any prior legal marriage existed, and was knowingly undisclosed during royal vetting procedures, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be a procedural breach, not a moral failing, not a scandal, a breach of protocol. And in institutional terms, that's often worse. Within Buckingham Palace, officials haven't confirmed or denied anything. But behind closed doors, sources say internal reviews have been launched, documentation is being examined, disclosure standards are being reassessed. The question isn't whether Meghan is guilty of anything. The question is whether any material omissions occurred during background checks before the 2018 wedding. And that distinction matters, because institutions don't operate on emotions, they operate on process. And if the process was compromised, the consequences are automatic. Public reaction, predictably, has been divided. Supporters argue this is a witch hunt fueled by media hostility and sexism. Critics say transparency is non-negotiable when personal history intersects with constitutional roles. Both sides are dug in. But here's what's interesting. Meghan herself has stayed almost entirely silent. A few brief legal statements rejecting the allegations. That's it. No interviews, no tearful confessions, no counter-narrative, just silence. Some analysts say this is smart. Don't add fuel to the fire. Let it burn out on its own. Others say it's the worst possible move because in the absence of clarification, people fill the void with assumptions, and assumptions are rarely kind. Either way, the Canadian years, once treated as a boring prelude to her royal life, have become the epicenter of a much bigger question. When does personal privacy end and public accountability begin? And while the world debated that question, Meghan's team was scrambling. What happened next wasn't dramatic, it was calculated. A crisis response playbook executed with precision. Legal threats, media spin, brand repositioning, the whole arsenal. First came the lawyers. Pre-litigation notices were sent to media outlets, podcasts, and digital platforms. These letters didn't claim anything was false. They emphasized potential liability, unauthorized insinuation, speculative linkage, voice attribution without consent. The goal wasn't to win in court, it was to make publishing risky enough that editors would hesitate. At the same time, takedown requests flooded social media platforms. Posts connecting her name to alleged sealed records or implying misrepresentation during royal vetting were flagged for removal. Many requests were denied under public interest exemptions. But the sheer volume slowed the conversation, fragmented the narrative, and made it harder for any single story to dominate. Then came the media counteroffensive. Within a 48-hour window, multiple opinion pieces appeared across U.S. and Canadian outlets. All of them carried the same themes: disgruntled ex-partners, opportunistic storytelling. The unreliability of memory filtered through resentment. The repetition was so coordinated that media watchdogs openly speculated about centralized pitching. This is textbook crisis management. You don't dispute every claim, you discredit the messenger, make it about character conflict, not facts. Lower the evidentiary standard in the public mind. In a saturated information environment, ambiguity can be just as effective as truth. Another front involved recontextualizing the Canadian years entirely. Internal briefing notes reportedly encouraged a career-only narrative. Minimize personal associations. Emphasize professional discipline. Former colleagues were approached for supportive quotes about focus, ambition, and independence. The strategy wasn't to erase relationships, it was to make them irrelevant. Simultaneously, brand architecture was being reassessed. Trademark filings for a new lifestyle platform were expedited. The message was clear: pivot away from identities entangled with royal affiliation. Create distance. Offer partners a narrative of renewal. But here's the problem. Accelerated rebranding during a crisis often looks like evasion, especially when legacy questions remain unresolved. And the counteroffensive hit another wall: timing. Because while legal threats and PR maneuvers unfolded, new voices kept entering the conversation. Former partners, past associates, royal commentators with institutional knowledge. Each new entry increased the cost of containment. In crisis management, momentum favors the side introducing information, not the one responding to it. And Meghan's team was stuck in response mode. Meanwhile, the institutions she was fighting, Buckingham Palace, Dubai's governance systems, commercial partners, weren't engaging publicly at all. They were working in silence, reviewing documents, checking timelines, assessing risk. And here's the brutal truth. Courts of public opinion can be influenced. Administrative reviews cannot. Legal intimidation may slow publishers, but it doesn't alter records. PR reframing can shift sentiment, but it can't retroactively amend submitted disclosures. By mid-February, the counteroffensive had fragmented the narrative but failed to restore control. The story persisted not because of any single allegation, but because of cumulative doubt. And every attempt to suppress or redirect attention became part of the story itself. When one side speaks loudly and the other prepares quietly, outcomes aren't determined by volume. They're determined by procedure. And procedure was about to deliver a verdict far harsher than any headline. While the public remained fixated on legal battles and media spin, something far more consequential was happening behind closed doors. The money was walking away, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. By mid-February 2026, multiple industry insiders described what they called a confidence pause across sectors previously tied to Meghan Markle's brand. Media deals, lifestyle partnerships, speaking engagements, long-term licensing agreements, nothing was officially canceled. But everything was stalling. Exploratory talks scheduled for late January were pushed to Q2 pending internal reassessment. Revenue share models shifted to fixed, performance-contingent structures, transferring risk away from the partner. In at least 2 cases, memoranda of understanding quietly expired without renewal. No confrontation, no explanation, just procedural silence. This is how corporate rejection works. Deals don't collapse loudly, they stall. Financial analysts will tell you this behavior isn't punitive, it's protective. Brands evaluate not just market reach, but volatility exposure. And when a public figure's profile requires constant contextualization, legal footnotes, reputational disclaimers, crisis clauses, the cost of association rises sharply. One senior branding consultant put it bluntly, "It's not about controversy, it's about predictability." If every activation risks becoming a headline for reasons unrelated to the product, the ROI calculus changes. Streaming platforms and media development discussions followed the same pattern. Concepts that once moved quickly through pitch stages entered prolonged development holds. Requests for additional due diligence increased. Background checks expanded beyond standard practice, now encompassing historical affiliations and prior contractual disputes. This reflects a broader industry shift. Since 2024, entertainment financiers have grown hypersensitive to reputational spillover, especially after high-profile projects were derailed by off-screen controversies. Greenlight committees now weigh narrative stability alongside creative potential. Merchandising and lifestyle ventures were affected differently. Rather than halting talks, some partners proposed structural separation, branding that minimized personal attribution, product lines fronted by third-party ambassadors. These proposals revealed a harsh truth. Partners wanted to preserve market opportunity while insulating themselves from individual risk. When a name becomes optional rather than central, leverage shifts. Royal affiliation, once a brand multiplier, had already been diluted. What remained was personal brand equity, and that was now under reassessment. Financial pressure didn't manifest as immediate loss. It manifested as constraint. Revenue streams became less diversified, advances shrank, payment schedules extended. Liquidity didn't vanish, flexibility did, And flexibility is what allows high-profile figures to absorb shocks without altering lifestyle or strategy. None of these moves implied legal guilt or formal sanction. They represented market behavior under uncertainty. Capital seeks environments where downside is bounded and explanations are unnecessary. When uncertainty expands, capital waits. And this waiting had a compounding effect. As major partners slowed, smaller collaborators followed suit, often citing alignment concerns. Momentum, that intangible but critical asset, began to dissipate. Projects relying on sequential commitments stalled when early adopters hesitated. The contrast with earlier phases was stark. In 2021 through 2023, association with Meghan carried aspirational value. By 2026, association required justification. That inversion altered negotiation dynamics across the board. Notably, none of this required coordination. Commercial ecosystems are networked but decentralized. When multiple actors independently reach similar conclusions, outcomes appear synchronized even without communication. This is how market consensus forms, quietly, incrementally, decisively. The commercial landscape hadn't collapsed, but it had tightened, options narrowed, timelines stretched, the margin for error shrank, and in such conditions, strategic patience becomes essential. But patience is difficult to maintain amid ongoing scrutiny. The next question facing industry analysts wasn't whether opportunities still existed. It was whether they could be pursued without exacerbating the very instability partners sought to avoid. And that's when commercial considerations began intersecting with something far more powerful: institutional consequences. What followed was not the explosive retaliation many expected. There were no emergency press conferences, no emotional rebuttals, no dramatic statements leaked to friendly journalists. Instead, the palace chose something far more devastating: restraint. Within constitutional circles, this response was immediately recognized as deliberate, because in royal terms, silence is never absence, it's pressure. Senior aides described the strategy as containment through credibility. Rather than engaging with allegations circulating online, the institution quietly began reinforcing its legal and moral perimeter. Titles weren't publicly stripped, but usage guidelines were reinterpreted. Invitations didn't vanish overnight, they simply never arrived. Access wasn't revoked in a headline, it was eroded through protocol. Behind the scenes, a comprehensive internal review was initiated. Every commercial contract, every public appearance, every third-party agreement associated with the Sussex brand since their departure from royal duties. The focus was narrow but consequential: whether any activity had crossed the boundary between private enterprise and implied royal endorsement. One constitutional lawyer involved in the process described it bluntly: "This isn't about punishment, it's about separation. The crown is reasserting the line between who represents the monarchy and who no longer does." The most sensitive dimension involved the children. Palace sources stressed that Archie and Lilibet weren't under scrutiny as individuals but as symbols. Their names, images, and implied status had become central to media strategies and commercial narratives far beyond the United Kingdom. That reality forced the institution into uncomfortable territory, protecting minors while disentangling them from brand exploitation. By late winter, new internal directives were issued. Any commercial use of royal titles, line of succession references, or symbolic imagery connected to minors would be challenged, not publicly, not dramatically, but legally, quietly, methodically. The effect was immediate. Streaming platforms grew cautious. Publishing houses requested revisions. Legal teams began inserting clauses where none had existed before. The momentum of monetization slowed, not because of scandal but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison in commercial storytelling. Meanwhile, within the royal family itself, a subtle recalibration was underway. Prince William, increasingly visible in matters of institutional integrity, emerged as a stabilizing force. His approach contrasted sharply with past eras of emotional damage control. There was no visible anger, no public condemnation, only structure. Observers noted a pattern: appearances emphasizing continuity, speeches focused on duty, symbolic gestures reinforcing the monarchy's role as an enduring institution rather than a personality-driven enterprise. One former court correspondent summarized it perfectly. "The message is simple: this family doesn't chase narratives, it outlasts them." Perhaps the most telling signal came not from what was said, but from what was omitted. In annual briefings, in official biographies, even in casual references, certain names began to disappear, not erased, deprioritized. The monarchy, after all, doesn't need to deny relevance, it merely reallocates it. For the public, this created a strange inversion. The louder the external narratives became, the quieter the institution responded. And in that contrast, credibility shifted. Because in the modern media age, where outrage is constant and disclosure is currency, silence backed by structure carries a unique authority. And that, insiders suggest, was always the plan. As the immediate turbulence began to settle, a deeper question emerged, one that extended beyond personalities, contracts, or headlines. What happens when modern celebrity logic collides with an institution designed to operate on centuries, not cycles? The answer, increasingly, appeared to favor time. For the monarchy, this episode reinforced a core doctrine. Relevance isn't maintained through reaction, but through endurance. Institutions that survive revolutions, wars, abdications, and scandals do so, not by winning arguments, but by outlasting them. In this framework, controversy isn't confronted head-on. It's absorbed, contextualized, and eventually neutralized by continuity. What many observers initially interpreted as passivity was, in retrospect, strategic inertia. By refusing to escalate, the Crown limited the lifespan of external narratives. Without direct engagement, accusations couldn't evolve into institutional conflict. They remained media events, finite, cyclical, and ultimately replaceable. For the individuals at the center of the storm, however, the calculus was different. Personal brands depend on momentum. They require constant validation, audience engagement, and narrative renewal. When scrutiny intensifies without corresponding access or endorsement, maintaining that momentum becomes exponentially harder. Every move invites reinterpretation. Every silence appears tactical rather than organic. This asymmetry proved decisive. By early spring, analysts noted a divergence. While the monarchy's approval metrics stabilized, public sentiment surrounding associated figures became increasingly polarized. Support remained strong within specific audiences, but broader appeal softened. Neutrality, that crucial ingredient for mass-market success, became elusive. The children, once framed as bridges between worlds, now stood at the center of unresolved tension. Their future role, royal, private, or something in between, remained undefined. And in that ambiguity lay the greatest risk, not of scandal, but of prolonged limbo. Legal experts emphasize that the institution's primary concern moving forward won't be punishment or precedent. It will be insulation. Ensuring that future generations are shielded from reputational volatility has become a priority across European monarchies, not just Britain's. The Sussex episode, in this sense, is being studied less as a family dispute and more as a case study in boundary failure. There are lessons here, for public figures, for institutions, and for an audience increasingly fluent in media literacy. Transparency, while powerful, isn't neutral. It reshapes incentives. It rewards immediacy over patience, emotion over structure. Institutions that adapt too quickly risk dissolving their authority. Those that adapt too slowly risk irrelevance. The Crown's response suggests it believes it has found a narrow path between the two. Whether history agrees remains to be seen. What is clear is that the center of gravity has shifted. The monarchy has reasserted itself not through dominance, but through detachment. It has drawn a line not with force, but with time. And time, unlike narrative, doesn't argue, it accumulates. In the years ahead, this period will likely be remembered not for any single allegation or revelation, but for the recalibration it forced. A reminder that institutions endure not because they are flawless, but because they are patient. And that in conflicts between legacy and visibility, legacy doesn't need to win the moment. It only needs to remain standing after the moment passes.